Hello and welcome to the qualifying edition of today's race weekend data analysis for the Spanish Grand Prix, the video series in which I'll be compiling all of the data from each and every qualifying session and pitting all of the teammates together and seeing which one comes out on top. And qualifying has literally just finished about half an hour ago, 45 minutes ago or so, after a small 10-minute delay due to a little barrier rechange actually, due to a crash in I believe the F3 feature race or one of the previous feature races at the weekend. But with that out of the way, we will take a look at the qualifying data for the Spanish Grand Prix. But first, we actually start with the qualifying results for my little prediction series that I am running. I am sat P3. This is the best I have ever done so far in my own bloody series. I am so very happy that I predicted an Alfa Tauri would be out in Q1. But looking down the rest of that order, we've got Evan Darcy doing oh so very well. The season leader so far, joint on my 11 points. Tom Sayer and Divet Rayhan as well, joint on 8. Then we've got Joshua Uiop also on 7, and then a couple people on 6 and 5 as well. But there is still a lot of points still on the table, with a lot of bold statements left that affect in the Grand Prix, and also of course the top 5 in the race. So there's still a lot of points to play for, but here are how the standings are after qualifying. And then to remind ourselves of the qualifying order, let's just quickly run through Q1. It was actually Lando Norris who topped this session, dipping into the 1-minute 17s. Then Valtteri Bottas, Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, with Gasly splitting the 2 Red Bulls. But out was Yuki Tsunoda. Absolutely very critical of the car, actually. Very, very critical of the car. And I can imagine in the next couple of media pens, he's not going to be as critical. But Q2, we actually had the 2 teammates from each of the top 5 teams. The 2 Red Bulls, the 2 Mercedes, the 2 Ferraris, the 2 McLarens and the 2 Alpines. I think that's the first time this has happened this season, I'm not 100% sure. But both Aston Martins out, Gasly out also for the first time this season. Russell down in P15 behind Giovinazzi. And interestingly too, all drivers will be starting on the soft compound of tyre. And also interestingly, the Mercedes will be starting on a lap or 2 older tyres than Max Verstappen, which is just as interesting. But that leads us in, of course, to Q3, which is topped by Lewis Hamilton, his 100th career pole, just 0.03 of a second back to Max Verstappen, and then about 0.1 back to Valtteri Bottas, and then maybe look at your watches for a bit. There's about a year's gap between the top 3 and Charles Leclerc, and then it is so uber close between Leclerc down to Perez down in P9, having a small little iffy first lap spinning, and then couldn't quite put it together on his final lap. But compiling all of these times together and whacking them into one great big graph, we can see that it looks much like the practice progression graph actually. Small improvements from Q1 to Q2 and then a plateau from Q2 to Q3. This season has sort of played havoc with these data trends. The past couple of races that I've looked at through 2020, I've seen a nice sort of decrease. As you would expect, you improve from Q1 to Q2, you improve again from Q2 to Q3. But this season, I haven't seen that at all. Very interesting. And then just taking each team's fastest times, regardless of which driver set it, and working out their improvement from each session, we can see that the furthest improved team from Q1 to Q2 was Red Bull down at the bottom, 1.1 seconds between the 2 sessions, as Williams characteristically actually lost time from session to session, as Russell puts in a mega Q1 lap and then cannot match it at all in Q2. That is very, very predictable from Williams. And then doing the same for the most improved from Q2 to Q3, it is actually Mercedes. They gained 0.4 of a second. Now this is the trends that we saw a lot in 2020, where they would gain like 1.2 seconds, 1.3 seconds from Q2 to Q3, and everyone else would gain piddles. But it's now Mercedes gaining 0.4, and then everybody else gaining piddles. But with the overview of qualifying data all done and dusted, we'll jump on into the teammate breakdowns. We are going in championship order of 2020, so we do start with Mercedes. Everything is timestamped in the description down below, so you can skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. But yes, we do start with Mercedes, and it is Lewis Hamilton once again beating out Valtteri Bottas. 3-1 in the Q3 head-to-head, but interestingly 3-1 in the Q1 head-to-head in favour of Valtteri Bottas. But taking a look at the Mercedes qualifying gaps for the Spanish Grand Prix, Bottas was 2.5 tenths faster in Q1 than Lewis Hamilton, compared to the season average ahead so far for the first 3 races of just 1.5 tenths. However, Lewis Hamilton's Q3 advantage over his teammate has shrunk or just over half, coming down from 3.5 tenths to 1.5 tenths. However, we move to Red Bull. Now, Sergio Perez. This is not an ideal performance whatsoever. In every single session, it is 3-1 currently in the head-to-head across the season. Q1 went okay, a 10th gap. That's not bad. Q2 almost getting knocked out and having a 7/10th gap to Max Verstappen, when the season average in the first 2 races has been 2.5 tenths. That is significant. And then in Q3, to not only bugger up your first lap and spin, and then to put all of the pressure on yourself on your final run to go 9 tenths slower, where the season average so far over the first 3 races in Q3 in favour of Max Verstappen is 1.5 tenths. This is not the weekend that Sergio Perez needed at all. This is even worse than the Albon and Gasly performances. What would have made it worse is if he was knocked out in Q2. This is not good at all. But from Red Bull, we then take a look at the Papaya McLaren team. And interestingly, Daniel Ricciardo has outqualified Lando Norris 3-1. It's just a shame he cannot translate this into the race performance. And his gap over Lando Norris in Q3 was significantly bigger than his average over the season so far. 0.5 tenth is the average across the season, and only 4 tenths was the advantage in Q3 this session. And compare that to Lando Norris's advantage over Daniel Ricciardo in Q1, that was 4 tenths for the Spanish Grand Prix, and the season average 8.5 tenths. And then from McLaren we take a look at Aston Martin, and they didn't make it into Q3. For the first time this season, neither driver made it through. It is 2-2 in the Q1 head-to-head, 3-1 in favour of Lance Stroll in the Q2 head-to-head, and 2-1 in the Q3 head-to-head. And in terms of the gaps, on average it was about, 0.07 of a second between the 2 sessions, and both gaps in favour of Lance Stroll are less than his season's average over Sebastian Vettel so far. Nothing else really to report from Aston Martin, other than they didn't make it into Q3. And then from Aston Martin, we take a look at Alpine. And again, a team that has a similar sort of progression to Red Bull. They actually set identical times in Q1. There was literally nothing, not even 1,000th of a second separated the 2 drivers. I can't remember who set it first. I think it was Esteban Ocon. Off the top of my head, I can't quite remember. But then the gap just sort of grew and grew and grew as we progressed through the sessions, from 2 tenths to 0.5 a second by Q3. And that Q3 gap, it's the first time that both drivers have made it into Q3 for the same time, so there is no average Q3 difference for these drivers just yet. It's also 3-1 in the head-to-head in every single session in favour of Esteban Ocon. And then from Alpine, we take a look at Ferrari, and this team is very much like McLaren of 2020 and 2019. These 2 teammates, Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, are just inseparable. On average, across the 3 sessions, the gap between each of them, whoever was in front, was about 1/10 of a second. It is 2-2 in the head-to-head in Q1 and in Q2, and then overall in Q3, it is 3-1 in favour of Charles Leclerc. And in terms of the gaps, in Q1 it has come down significantly from the season's average. It is 1.5 tenths in Q1 in the Spanish Grand Prix, and that has come down from almost a second in Charles Leclerc's favour. And then comparing that to the Q3 gap, which again in Charles Leclerc's favour, that is 1/10 of a second, his season's average across the 3 races that have happened previous has been 0.5 a second. And then from Ferrari, we take a look at Alfa Tauri, and a team that very much underperformed based on what's previously happened in this season. Yuki Tsunoda being knocked out in Q1, and Pierre Gasly not even making it to Q3. And the gap between the 2 drivers in Q1 was 3.5 tenths of a second, with actually the average across the season so far being only 2 tenths of a second in favour of Pierre Gasly. But other than that, not much else to report from AlphaTauri, just a very disappointing session with neither driver making it into Q3. And then from AlphaTauri, we take a look at Alfa Romeo, and again, this is where my graphs start to become a little bit more sparse, as there's a little bit less data to take a look at. Obviously, neither driver made it into Q3, and only Antonio Giovinazzi made it through to Q2. And the gap between him and Raikkonen in Q1 was 3.5 tenths, with the average so far in Giovinazzi's favour across the 3 races being 4 tenths of a second. So that gap has come down a little bit in the Spanish Grand Prix, but overall I would say it's a little bit of a disappointing session for Alfa Romeo. And then penultimately we take a look at Haas, and again the graphs are very sparse as neither driver have yet to make it into Q2, with Mick Schumacher once again qualifying P18 for the second time this season, and once again for the 4th time in a row ahead of Nikita Mazepin. The gap 7 tenths of a second. This is one of the larger qualifying gaps that have happened so far, and it is 9 hundredths above the average across the first 3 races. And annoyingly, he was actually progressing quite nicely in the practice sessions, going from 1.2 seconds to 6 tenths to 2 tenths, and now it's gone back up to 7 tenths of a second. And then finally, for the qualifying edition of today's race weekend data analysis for the Spanish Grand Prix, we take a look at Williams. And again, the graphs are a little bit sparse. And once again, we see that traditional and predictable increase from Q1 to Q2 from Williams, where George Russell puts in a stellar Q1 lap time and then a not so stellar Q2 lap time. And the gap between the 2 drivers in Q1 was 7 tenths of a second, one of the largest teammate gaps that we've seen so far, and 2 tenths faster than the season's average across the first 3 races. But other than that, not much else to report other than Nicholas Latifi is still yet to outqualify George Russell in that Williams. And there we go, there is all of the qualifying data all wrapped up for the Spanish Grand Prix. Please let me know what you think in the comments down below, and also what you thought of today's episode. Where did you place in the predictions as well? Let me know, and let me know how well you are doing. But that's all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.